All right, I'm just going to go ahead with a brief introduction here. Then I'll turn things over to Mike. I just wanted to thank everybody on behalf of BJA for joining us on this discussion session on the latest research regarding the organizational and individual outcomes of body-worn cameras. My name is Chip Coldren. I'm the director of the Center for Justice Research and Innovation here at the CNA Institute for Public Research and the director of technical assistance for the Bureau of Justice Assistance body-worn camera TA program. As I said, I'll give a brief introduction here. I think we all know, and we know that BJA appreciates the important role of research. If we want to find out what works or what helps, what seems to make a difference regarding the implementation of body-worn cameras at agency, individual, and community levels, sooner or later we have to turn to the research. Now, Mike White and his colleagues at Arizona State University have not only contributed greatly to this body of research work, they've done a wonderful job of tracking, consolidating, and cataloging body-worn camera research. Hence his involvement in our discussion today, and I'll turn the program over to him in a quick minute. Let me just note that he will introduce several researchers who will discuss their work, and John Markovic, our body-worn camera program director at BJA, will provide some additional remarks later in the program. Just please note that we are recording this session so we can view it later on. There will be opportunities for questions, so please make your thoughts and questions known. I can assure you that others will appreciate hearing what you have to say. Let me also thank Quinn Patterson, Rachel Johnston, and Carrie Shelton at CNA, who do the background work to develop these sessions and make sure they go smoothly. So Mike, I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Chip. As Chip said, my name's Mike White, professor at Arizona State University and a co-director of the TTA program. I just wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit with some comments about the body research on body-worn cameras before we dive in. And as many of us know, the pace at which this evidence base has grown has really been pretty remarkable. As recently as 2015, there were 5 or fewer studies on the impact of body-worn cameras. And here we are, fast forward to 2021, we have now, more than 100 different studies, probably many more than 100. And, the pace at which this research has come out created some challenges. For starters, it's just simply hard to keep track. Every week, there's a new study that comes out on the impact of body-worn cameras on some outcomes. So it's just dizzying in some cases to try to keep up with that. The second challenge, though, is that the outcomes of interest that researchers have focused on has also grown substantially. If you look back at some of those early studies in 2013 and 2014, 15, they were almost exclusively focused on 2 outcomes: use of force by police and citizen complaints. But if you look at the more recent studies, we now see a whole range of different outcomes: officer perceptions, citizen perceptions, procedural justice. There was a study that came out a couple of months ago on the impact of body-worn cameras on stop and frisk decisions, court outcomes, officer safety. We're going to hear about some of these different outcomes today. So that's been another challenge, is just the outcomes that people are focused on has grown quite a bit. And then the third challenge, of course, is that the findings have gotten more mixed over time. You look at those early studies that focused on force and complaints, they were pretty consistent in terms of documenting reductions in those outcomes associated with body-worn cameras. But as time has passed, the evidence base has gotten more mixed, and a bunch of us have talked about why we think that is, and we're looking at implementation. Local context, I think, is really important. So anyway, just the speed at which this research has come out presents these challenges. And as Chip said, ASU, one of our jobs, or our primary job, I think, is to stay on top of all that and to figure out ways to make this very quickly growing body of evidence understandable and digestible for policymakers, for other researchers, and for practitioners, particularly those who are funded through this grant funding program. And we do a couple of things to try to accomplish that goal of making the research understandable and digestible. And one of the things we do, we've created what we call outcome directories. So if you go to our TTA website, we've created products that we think are pretty user-friendly that highlight all of the studies on a given outcome. So you can go in and look at the 30 plus studies that have looked at officer perceptions and see what they say, or use of force or complaints or officer activity. But the other thing we do is every once in a while we bring together a group of researchers who are actively involved in this space, and that's why we're here today. We're gonna hear from three researchers who are doing work, who are doing important work on the impact of body-worn cameras, and I'll introduce those folks in a second. The format that we're going to follow as soon as I stop talking is that each of these researchers will give a presentation of about 10 minutes or so on the current work that they're involved in. And then we have a discussant, Dr. Charles Katz. Chuck is at ASU with me. He's a senior member of the TTA team. Chuck's going to lead a Q&A then with these three researchers. And then hopefully at the time, after that is done, we'll hear from John Markovic. We'll have, and then some time hopefully for questions from the audience. So just real quickly, I'll introduce these folks and then we can get rolling. The three researchers who are presenting today. First is Dr. Jennifer Wood. Dr. Wood is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Temple University in Philadelphia, my alma mater. And Dr. Wood's research focuses on the policing of vulnerable populations, and she's especially interested in efforts to align the goals of both public safety with public health. We also have with us Dr. Joel Miller from the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice in Newark, just up I-95 from Jen. Dr. Miller has held a number of positions, both academic and policy, in Europe and the US, including the UK Home Office and Bureau Institute of Justice before going to Rutgers. And Dr. Miller's work focuses on street level police conduct, its regulation. He's also conducted work or research in evidence-based principles and community corrections and some other areas. Our final presenter is Dr. John McCluskey. Dr. McCluskey is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Dr. McCluskey is going to present on some work he's been engaged in with one of our senior partners, Dr. Craig Yachida. And Dr. McCluskey's work is focused on the research. His research is on the impact of body-worn cameras, how it affects police and local criminal justice actors and processes. And as I said, after the three researchers give their presentations, Dr. Katz will lead a Q&A. I think Chuck's been involved in this body-worn camera research longer than just about anybody. He was involved in the initial BJA-funded evaluation of body-worn cameras in the Phoenix Police Department. So that's the format. I think at this point, I think Dr. Jennifer Wood is going to go first. So Quinn, we'll kick it back to you and Dr. Wood can get started.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Today, I'm going to share with you a very small piece of a much larger study assessing the implementation of body-worn cameras in Philadelphia. I'm here on behalf of our team, my co-PI, Liz Groff. We've been working together now for several years on this study in Philadelphia, and Dejanay Talley, one of our doctoral students who played a key role in analyzing some data that I'll be reporting on today. What I'm going to focus on today is a piece that derives from some focus group work that we did with officers in Philadelphia across a range of districts, across a range of different levels of experience on the job, as well as 10 focus groups with community groups from across the city in different strata, people who are sort of work as pastors, as teachers, as students, and as citizens in the community. These focus groups were conducted early on in the study. They were developed for two purposes. One was to help develop and refine measures for a survey instrument. We're currently in the stages of conducting wave 2 of that survey, which is being implemented with both police and citizens. And there's a larger piece as well using PPD administrative data to examine any changes in police officer behavior. The focus groups also play a key role in understanding the data that have been coming out with respect to the surveys and the data that will be coming out with respect to the analysis of the PPD administrative data on officer activity. I just want to start in the interest of time highlighting three key messages that came out of these two focus group pieces for us. And I'm trying to connect them today and help explain to you what I think they mean in terms of needed future research on really the importance of context and contingency and understanding the potential effects of body-worn cameras on people's behaviors as well as police-community relationships. And so the central message is this, that body-worn cameras could, according to the perceptions of police and citizens, foster improved behaviors and police community relationships, depending on three key things: the person, including the officer themselves, as well as the citizen, the situation or the job, and it also depends on how the cameras will be used in the governance of policing. And by that, I refer to cameras being used as a mechanism for enhanced transparency and enhanced accountability. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of each of these ideas and then try to tie them together in the end. When we conducted the focus groups with police, as many of you know, police officers illustrate really important insights through stories and storytelling. And much of what they told us was it depends in terms of the potential for the cameras to foster heightened levels of compliance with their directives, as well as to improve police community relationships. They often focused on the encounters themselves. Here's an example of a passage from one focus group. An officer said, "I think there's a very high percentage that people who you encounter that will typically listen. As far as having a camera that make people comply a little more, some of the percentage that don't generally comply, that's where baiting would come in." The issue of baiting was an interesting finding. It cut across the focus groups. There was the point made by many officers that generally the public complies with police directives, but there are those who will perform in front of the camera according to their view, and who may try to test officers and try to find ways to provoke them and have them act out in front of the camera. So they referred to this as baiting. From another focus group, an officer said it all depends on who you were dealing with. In some ways, the camera will calm people down. In other situations, people will perform. So this connects with the previous comment that there's a performance dimension related to cameras. Some officers even suggested that younger generations of residents tend to be more performative in the presence of a camera because they have grown up acting in front of cameras and their cell phones. Police officers often told us as well that it depends on the job. And so when we were probing an officer in a particular focus group about whether they thought people might sort of calm down and de-escalate their behavior, an officer said, "It depends what type of job it is, really." And so the facilitator asked, "Can you give me an example?" And they said, "A domestic where someone's drunk. No matter what's going on, they're not going to calm down. The camera's not going to help them calm down." And so this was told to us time and time again, that it depends on the situation, it depends on the job. The example of domestic violence contexts were often used as well to illustrate that sometimes emotions are so high that you would not get a different outcome if you had a camera activated. So when we spoke to officers, they tended to focus on those sort of everyday micro interactions. Would the cameras move the needle, right, on their behavior, on citizens' behaviors? Officers said that with their own behavior as well, it depended on the officers. For officers who generally do a very good job, who act professionally, their behavior wouldn't change. But for some officers, their behavior may become more professional. They'd be less likely to use inappropriate language, and they may simply de-escalate their behavior in certain situations when they know they are being recorded. When we spoke to communities, though, there was a different focal concern. There was less attention paid to everyday interactions and more attention paid to the bigger picture. So the cameras ended up being used as a sort of a vehicle to discuss broader points around governance and oversight of police work. And there were two aspects to this that are connected but that are distinct. One relates to transparency. There were a variety of ways in which community members talked about what transparency means to them. An emblematic quote in this regard was this idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. right? Will the cameras be used as a mechanism for transparency? And related to that, the residents also wanted to have much better public education campaigns related to educating them on the police directive for how cameras would be used. Could they be turned on and off? What would happen after? Who would have access to the footage? And so on. So transparency was a really fundamental concept. It was a concept they used organically in the groups, and they unpacked it in a variety of different ways. Related to transparency is this notion of accountability. There was some cynicism across the groups that even in light of footage being present and being used, and even having footage available in light of some very egregious police behavior over the last couple of years, that there still was no accountability for police conduct. And so for them, transparency was necessary, but not sufficient in terms of ensuring that policing and police work was governed appropriately. So what happens after behavior, from their point of view, that is bad behavior, is spotted on camera? What happens next? Is there going to be punishment? Is there going to be remedial action? Will there be education, training, corrective actions? So it wasn't always punishment, but it was always, how can we use the cameras as a mechanism to ensure that this behavior would not happen again? And in this quote, they emphasize accountability and the hope that the objective of the cameras will be accountability, because credibility and accountability is lacking. And moreover, that the cameras would be a tool not only to help the public trust the police, but it would also be a tool to foster trust in citizens, that citizens would also have to hold themselves accountable as well to how they act with police. So it was seen as a two-way concept. There would be transparency and accountability that went both ways. So if we bring this all together and emphasize this broader point around context, which was something that officers emphasized around everyday police citizen interactions, we have to understand as well that it's not just simply improving behavior within particular types of situations. It's using the cameras as a tool to foster stronger governance of police work and policing, which would in turn foster improved police community relationships. So it's almost like there's these different levels at which body-worn cameras could be a mechanism for moving the needle, for improving how police and citizen behave towards one another, and for improving remedial actions when bad behavior does happen. And this all contributes to strengthening trust and legitimacy in the police. So for us, the insights, and I could not do them justice here, I've picked a few important themes for us that I think are provocative of a couple of different points, is the emphasis by officers on these micro level interactions, this concern with baiting, this concern with, it depends how someone behaved towards me, and then I will behave sort of in kind, in turn, sort of tit for tat. It emphasizes the importance of understanding social interactions, that these are dynamic situations. And there's a rich sociological tradition that has examined social interactions, this idea of tit for tat. When you behave a certain way, it means something to me, and I will return the favor in kind, and behave in response to how your behavior means to me. And so I think it's important in future studies to focus on scenario-based studies rather than looking at general outcomes across populations of people and across populations of officers, but to really look at specific situations, specific jobs, as officers would put it, and think about how we could manipulate those scenarios or vignettes in terms of how people behave, how the individual behaves, how the officer behaves, what's happening, say, in a domestic violence situation, how the camera might be able to foster better behavior in that particular situation and play that out. There's also some important work on motivational postures in the regulatory and compliance literature, which is similar to the social interaction literature, looking at how people engage in posturing with one another, in particular, how citizens display postures against authorities, including police. And there's some important work on defiant postures and the way in which citizens display their defiance towards authorities in very subtle ways, and how authorities need to read those signals to understand how to respond in ways that improve that relationship rather than just responding in kind. With respect to the governance and oversight work that is obviously a clear implication of the community groups. The implication for practice here is there should be much better attention to developing education strategies for the public in terms of understanding how the cameras will work in fostering transparency and accountability. But there also needs to be a piece here around educating police as to what citizens view as transparent policing and as accountable policing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wood. I think now we will switch over to Dr. Miller. And Quinn, I'm going to let you handle that.
So thanks to the organisers, thanks to Mike for the invitation again, to participate in this really interesting session. I'm going to talk about some highlights from a study that I recently published with a co-author at the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers, Vijay Chilla, a PhD student. This was recently published in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology. I've posted obviously details of that publication for those who are interested on this slide. And I think right now, if you go to the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, you'll find that there's no paywall in front of this. So for those who are interested, I think you could be able to get a copy of that if you really want to get into the weeds. I'm going to today try and avoid the weeds as much as possible in talking about some of the highlights, as I say. So by way of background, and Mike's, I think, updated some of the numbers on this slide, but we now have, as Mike tells us, over 100 studies on body-worn cameras. There was a kind of a Campbell collaboration systematic review that identified 30 specific evaluation studies focused on body-worn cameras' effects on police outcomes. And as Mike pointed out, some of those kinds of studies now show some quite mixed findings. What's notably absent, or what has been notably absent until recently, are studies that have specifically focused on citizen fatalities as outcomes of police community interactions. And there's a reason for that. These events are comparatively rare, and specific evaluation studies which tend to focus on individual police agencies or focus on maybe clusters of a handful of agencies. Well, within those kind of local contexts, the number of fatalities arising from police-citizen encounters are simply too few to support meaningful quantitative analysis. And so that's really where the current study comes in. We've sort of tried to take a different kind of strategy for trying to make an inference about whether body-worn cameras have an effect on the rates of fatalities. And the way we have approached that is really to take the whole country, the whole of the United States as our laboratory, if you like, and really to sort of capitalize on the fact that body-worn cameras really took off substantially just in the last few years. We have this very sort of substantial growth on the right-hand side of this slide. You'll see in 2012, for example, only about 88% of law enforcement agencies had acquired body-worn cameras, but by mid-2016, that was getting on for about half. So our plan was to try and examine whether this sort of rapid increase in body-worn camera usage across the United States had any statistical relationship with patterns of fatal encounters. So the methodology that we used to address this question is something called a difference in difference analysis. And the basic idea behind a difference in difference analysis is you look at groups of cases, in our case, obviously law enforcement agencies, that are following essentially similar trends in terms of their patterns, their outcomes, in our case, fatal encounters, right? And then you look at whether those trends change at the point when one or more of those groups adopt body-worn cameras? Do we see a change in the trend associated with that, the introduction of that intervention? Now, what's interesting about this approach, and it's a little different from, let's say, running a randomized control trial or some other kind of quasi-experiment where you typically find you're trying to get two groups that are roughly the same. With a difference in difference analysis, your assumption is not that the two groups are the same in their characteristics, but the agencies are, in the absence at least of body-worn cameras, following essentially a similar trend over time. And so that's the approach we took. And for those who are technically minded, we did that using Poisson-based models, which particularly focus on count data. So how did we actually operationalize this in terms of pulling data together? Well, one of the primary resources we were able to use, which is very valuable here, was a Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics survey in 2016, which asked police agencies about whether they had body-worn cameras, and if they had them, at what point in time they'd acquired them. And we were able to identify from that group about 1,300 and change agencies that acquired body-worn cameras in a particular window of time. And this window really coincides with a big sort of growth in body-worn cameras. And that's between the year 2013 to 14. This is not exact calendar year. And then 2015 to 16. So there's a 3-year window we're focused on. And then against that, we had what we call our sort of control group of police agencies that didn't acquire any body-worn cameras at all up to 2016 when the survey was conducted, and apparently had no expectation, at least in the following year, of getting cameras. So our sort of assumption was they were not likely to get cameras. We were able to tie this data, furthermore, the agency level data that we had in these groups to information about fatal encounters that had happened in each of those agencies. And we did that by relying on a database that's maintained by a sort of independent research unit, or sort of a small organization called fatalencounters.org. It's not a government resource, but nonetheless provides probably the most reliable long-term measure of fatal encounters that we have. And so that's what we used. We did 3 basic analyses that I'm going to focus on. One is looking at how things change from one year to the next over about 14 years. Changes in the rates of fatalities, but also changes obviously in acquisition of cameras. And then in a second analysis, we did a sort of simple pre-post analysis where we looked we had 2 measurement periods, one before, one after. And these measurement periods were essentially sort of 3-year periods, pre and post this acquisition period. And we looked again whether fatalities had changed with the acquisition of cameras. And then in a third analysis, we sort of repeated that logic, but this time we matched our treatment and control agencies using something called a propensity score, which essentially tries to bring them into line, make them sort of similar in terms of sort of relevant background variables. I won't dwell on the sample characteristics, but they're there, and we can come back and talk about them if people are interested. I'll jump really to the findings. This, and I've got my little laser pointer here, but this table really, I'm not very good. I wouldn't be a sort of great crime writer because I'm sort of giving you the headline findings, and then I'm going to go on to explain them afterwards. But essentially, across these 3 different analytical strategies, we came up with estimates of the effects of body-worn cameras. Now, all 3 strategies led to an estimate of a reduction or relative reduction in fatalities associated with the introduction of body-worn cameras, which is obviously a positive finding. And as you can see from these numbers, that sort of range, there was a sort of range of values, but very approximately in the sort of 20 to 30% sort of area. But I'll also add that of these 3 strategies, only 2 actually returned estimates that were statistically significant, right? So this is not a clean sweep. The propensity score matched analysis was shy of significance, okay, which means we can have a little less confidence in that analysis. So what I want to do in the next few slides is really just provide some sort of visual data, some visual representations that allow us maybe to appreciate some of the patterns that underpin these core results that I'm presenting currently on this slide. I'll start, which was perhaps the most important, or certainly the most intuitive sort of visual slide. And in this slide, we kind of compare the 2 groups of police agencies. One being what we call the treatment group, those that go on to get cameras. And that's this top group that's in the sort of black color. And then we have underneath the control group. This is the group that don't go on apparently to get cameras during the time period. I'll also mark in yellow this window, this 3-year window when cameras were acquired at some point at least for the treatment group, right? What you can see, I think a few takeaways from here, what you can see in the sort of period prior to the acquisition of cameras, you see that both treatment and control agencies are following a similar trend. The ratio of fatalities in treatment and control group to treatment to control groups is essentially similar across this time period. Then what you see in the treatment group only, you don't see it in the control group, is that this trend starts to change, right? So it sort of flattens here and then it declines. This is a sort of clear suggestion of a body-worn camera effect, and it underpins, as I mentioned, the statistically significant effect that we saw on the previous slide when we look at the sort of pre-post analysis. And just to sort of finish out on this slide, I've marked in red here the sort of the 3-year period after and the 3-year period before, where we took the main measurements that went into the statistical model I reported earlier. On this next slide, I've sort of repeated the same logic, but in this case, what I'm presenting are the results of the propensity score matched treatment and control groups. Now, these are much more similar, and consequently, you can see that their rates of fatal encounters are more similar also. Now, you'll recall this did not produce a significant result, but nonetheless did suggest an effect. And you can see that pattern here, and it's probably most clear when you look at these dotted lines, which are a sort of smoothed average, right? So these are essentially taking out the lumps and bumps in the main lines. And what you see is this control group here, which has a slightly lower rate of fatalities, actually crosses over with the treatment group during this acquisition period. So a hint of an effect, certainly. And then in this final graphic, which I won't spend a lot of time on, this is not a straightforward representation of raw data. This is actually results from a modeling exercise. But this black line essentially tells us how treatment and control cases differ for the 8 years before acquisition and then the 3 to 4 years after acquisition of cameras. I'll draw your attention primarily to this part here where my sort of red pointer is kind of hovering. This shows us essentially the pattern of impact of or estimated impact of the body-worn cameras. You'll see that at year 0, you're starting to get this kind of negative effect. 0 is here, right? You're starting to get a negative effect, and that negative effect grows over time. So you're seeing a progressively greater effect of the body-worn cameras as time passes after the introduction of the cameras. And again, this is consistent with what I've presented earlier, which are sort of significant effects for the body-worn cameras in the sort of year-on-year analysis, one of the 3 analyses. Excuse me. So just by way of conclusion, obviously these results are encouraging. They do suggest an effect, but it's not a smoking gun. There were some inconsistencies across the strategies we used. One of the challenges of relying on something like a difference in analysis compared to something like a randomized experiment is there are alternative explanations also for what we may have found. And one possibility here, I think, is that body-worn cameras could act as a kind of proxy or a marker for a broader range of changes and reforms that may have been going on in the same departments that acquired body-worn cameras. And if that is the case, then the body-worn camera effect could be, in a sense, reflect these broader changes that happened alongside body-worn cameras too. Also, keep in mind that the findings here are driven in particular by the experiences of larger law enforcement agencies. These disproportionately featured in the survey. They're also disproportionately represented among those who acquire cameras. And also our estimates are heavily driven by those, perhaps inevitably, who have fatal encounters, and those tend to be larger agencies. So there is a kind of a stronger representation here in the findings, if you like, from sort of larger law enforcement agencies. I'll just finish by noting that the 20 to 30% approximate sort of estimate of a reduction is not to be sniffed at. It's a fairly notable effect, but I should also note that it doesn't sort of, in a sense, on its own at least, sort of solve what is essentially a very large disparity in rates of fatal encounters in the United States compared to other similar nations or other advanced nations. So, for example, Canada has compared to Canada, the US remains with 3 to 4 times the rate of fatal encounters arising from police encounters. So obviously, going forward, body-worn cameras need to be, just one component, I guess, in a sort of broader strategy. But I'll stop there and make way for our next speaker. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Miller. And last but certainly not least, Dr. John McCluskey.
Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the video data analysis and police body-worn camera footage for the purposes of research. And we specifically want to cover the quality and compare uses of body-worn camera footage for social science research applications with respect to systematic social observation and in-person observations. So a little bit of a departure from what's come before. To accomplish this, we plan to describe the research using BWC footage, give a quick overview of the systematic social observation and our research site, and then I'll present some data we collected and how it relates to key questions that we want to address here. What is the quality of body-worn camera footage that's obtained from BWC? And what is the concordance between in-person coding of police encounters and that derived from the coding of body-worn camera footage? So sort of a comparison of those methods. The quality of body-worn camera footage for social science purposes or general purposes has been addressed by many, including Boyvin here, in terms of considering the distortions of perspective that might be introduced by cameras as one among several problems that could influence what a viewer of BWC footage concludes, and perhaps the kind of data and error one might get from coding based on it. As a social science tool, BWC footage has been used in our count about 10 articles, including some by Willits and Macon examining use of force, and Voigt and colleague study of police-citizen interactions in the context of traffic stops in Oakland. Those are both well-executed exemplars of some BWC analysis. Given this growing use, developing a more refined sense of reliability of the data is something that we think is an important question, and especially as we think this use case is probably going to grow substantially in the future. Okay, our site for data collection was the Los Angeles Police Department. And in particular, we looked at the Mission Division in the north and the Newton Division in central LA during 2016, when they had already adopted BWC for more than 6 months. Both divisions are staffed by about 230 officers, and it's important to note they deploy in two-person patrol units. Our project involved in-person systematic social observation. So both before and after the adoption of BWC in LA, but here we're only interested in the post-adoption SSO. We had observers riding along with patrol officers. And SSO entails training observers to collect data according to a carefully defined protocol, and in this case, riding along with officers and coding aspects of their activities and encounters with citizens. Our research project in the field was focused on the procedural justice displayed by officers in their encounters with citizens, but we collected a wide variety of data. After the 2016 in-person field observations, we were able to access 102 videos from those two divisions, and they corresponded to encounters and activities that our observers coded while on the in-person rides. The videos were account for 53 unique events, and they correspond to 7 activities. And activities are police activities that do not involve a citizen, but they are perhaps involving consultation with another public service provider surrounding some problem. Something that's probably a little more interesting to everyone here is 46 encounters that were observed by in-person coders and also captured on video. So we have 46 encounters that we captured. We tasked separate coders to assess the quality and content of the BWC, and we adapted the SSO instruments from the field to measure some parallel aspects of police-citizen encounters. The coding that we conducted was done at computer terminals in LAPD headquarters, and the quality of the video that we were looking at was 480p resolution. An initial task of the video coders was to examine footage with regard to quality of audio channel. And here is the audio quality on the assessment for the sample of videos that we were looking at. The pie chart all the way on the left-hand side of your screen shows you that about 12.7% of the time, audio was judged by our coders to be indecipherable in video review. Coders assessed then the characteristics of participant speech. Participants are not officers, but they could be other service providers, they could be citizens. And they indicated that that audio track offered little or no record for participant speech about 10% of the time. And moving all the way over to the rightmost pie chart, you can see in comparison, officer speech, that is the officer wearing the camera, was only indecipherable about 2% of the times. So that suggests there's some kind of differential reliability here in terms of thinking about what we might capture in terms of participants versus the wearer in the audio channel. Coders were also asked to judge what the source of interference was, and two big problems regarding audio quality were surfaced. One is background noise, and the second is distance. This makes sense since the wearer is, in this case, the officer has the microphone mounted on them, and participants are, by definition, going to be somewhat farther away. So that makes sense. And background noise as well is going to likely attenuate what the microphone can pick up. One thing that we thought might be interesting is to look at whether this is systematically related to location types. So we coded the camera footage as being indoor or outdoor, and our comparison indicated that outdoor encounters were significantly more likely to have those two kinds of audio problems compared to their indoor counterparts. In other words, indoor encounter location is a correlate with a higher quality of audio in our sample. All right, so that's the audio channel. The video channel is the second channel that we wanted our coders to look at, and again, judge it by quality. We have 89 videos that feature encounters with citizens. That is somebody that is a civilian in a role such as victim, witness, suspect, etc. And so we asked the video coders how confident they were going to be in terms of describing citizen characteristics. And you can see here in the panel on the right-hand side of the screen, they were confident that they could describe the citizen's characteristic about 30% of the time, 29% to be exact. And a question you might have is, what are the causes of video interference noted by the coders? And the two big ones that stood out were the lighting, which 40% of the time was noted as a problem, and camera angle, which was considered a problem by our coders about half the time. So the thing I would point out here is there could be multiple problems in a video. So the sources of interference add up to more than 100%. So we're not able to tell you with much confidence about the apparent race or gender of persons with whom which police are encountering due to some of these issues. So we'll keep that in mind. Originally, we were thinking about this in terms of systematic social observation data that had been collected originally in the field by in-person observers and comparing that to the video-based data collection across 46 encounters. So just for a second, in terms of in-person SSO, we have a unit of analysis that is the citizen, and we have to aggregate citizens up to an encounter. That is, if there were 3 citizens encountered by a police officer, then from our field data, we have to combine them all together and use that aggregate as a comparison, because the videos capture possibly all 3 people, and we can't reliably match a citizen from the video to the citizen that was observed by our field coders. Our protocol for this included directions for coding a few procedural justice items and some citizen states and behaviors that we could compare here across the 2 modalities. The first thing to address here with this slide is that these are binary outcomes. So participation on the left-hand side, for example, represents whether or not the officer asked for a citizen's input in the encounter. Either it happened or it didn't. Did the police officers ask for any citizen's input in this encounter would be sort of the question for the video coder. And that's a binary outcome, yes or no. So we're able to take the aggregated citizens from the in-person SSO and get the same measure and have sort of parallel items from the encounters in the 2 different methodologies that could be compared. And here we have looked at the concordance and discordance of what's observed among those 46 encounters. And you can see that 76% of the time, we find that there's concordance in the measure of participation, and 24% of the time, there's discordance in terms of whether police solicited citizen participation. If we look over to the right chart, measuring police respectful behaviors, we have a concordance measure of 83% of the time and discordance 17% of the time. Importantly, we also calculated a kappa statistic, which takes into account the idea that there is chance agreement across the methods. We see a kappa of 0.32 in the green ellipse at the bottom for participation and 0.21 for respect. And this indicates that there's sort of a fair level of agreement across the two observation modalities. On this slide, we have police and citizen disrespect. 11% of encounters have discordant measurement and 89% have concordant measurement in coding of police disrespect. If we look at citizen disrespect, interestingly enough, it looks like this contrast yields much more discordant observation, with disagreement 17% of the time. That kappa statistic becomes much more important to us here, and you can see that it's negative 0.06, indicating no agreement between the two modalities for police disrespect, and the kappa for citizen disrespect is 0.29, suggesting, again, fair agreement. So correcting for that chance agreement, we have no real reliability between the two modalities in terms of what they're capturing. And that's partially due to the fact that there's very little police disrespect to be observed in either mode of observation. So a naive guess of no disrespect would almost always be correct. And that's why we see such a result as this. So what do we have here? The video record that we have from the BWC we studied here in LA is derived from low impact cases. That is, the police work that we're observing in the LAPD patrol observations doesn't feature very much arrest or use of force. Nothing that we observe would be considered a critical incident. So these are calls for disturbances, parties, neighbor and family trouble that are on the whole routine. But this is everyday routine police work in LAPD is situations that don't stress the camera. Officers aren't running, the camera's not being jostled, it's not being knocked off of officers. And still we see substantial shortcomings. In 13% of videos, the audio has some low quality. 10% of the time, there are indiscernible video channels obtained. And you could add to this the transient problems that crop up that we haven't really treated here. But clearly, officer movement, blockage, these are all things that appear throughout videos. So the comparisons between these two SSO modalities suggests that there's some substantial differences in terms of what's captured. And I'd say if we dove deeper into our research than we've gone here, to the extent measures are reliant on audio channel, they tend to have a bit more reliability as comparative measures in the two SSO modalities. And we might suggest that measures relying more on the video channel are not quite as concordant, as they often clearly omit one actor, the officer, and as our observers or coders from the video coding indicate, their ability to capture even citizens is incomplete at best. Where do we go from here? There seem to be some systematic weaknesses with BWC, and we have at least 12 suggestions, but Quinn said stick to 2. So first of all, I think that researchers using BWC could consider standardized reporting, and specifically thinking about, what is your sample in terms of characteristics? How's it drawn from the police agency and the police agency's record management system? What's missing regarding the capture of data in terms of number of videos or number of kinds of cases that are not available for being used? How many cases have multiple videos from which to code, and were they used? Second is sort of assessing the BWC used in terms of what we've kind of thought here is ease, difficulty, completeness. And what does that mean? The quality of the video as a record would serve as a mechanism for reliability checks. That is, not all the video is very clear, as we've shown, but perhaps it could be coded as providing more or less information, right, as a variable itself. So this might help with the recognition that video capture is itself kind of a filter through which data could be coded. I think that might be it.
All right, thank you, John. As I said, Professor Katz is going to lead a Q&A. I realize we're about 10 minutes behind schedule, but given we've had 4 academics speak, me included, the fact that we're only 10 minutes behind schedule is pretty remarkable. So Chuck, I'll kick it over to you and you get started.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentations, everybody. We definitely got a heavy dose of methodology and statistics over our past three panels, which I think is helpful. I do think that one of the things that we've seen with the evolution of body-worn camera research is really just a substantial change in the way research is being conducted among the police. BJ, as well as NIJ, has funded a substantial amount of work that has relied not only on randomized controlled trials, which were quite frankly pretty rare in the past, but we've also seen other types of work that we witnessed here in terms of some advances in methodological approaches to understand policing and contacts with the public. So what I would like to do is start off with a few questions. Jennifer, I was going to start off with you, if you don't mind, and I'm going to stick with this theme of methodology. But in speaking about our understanding of police contacts with the public, you spoke a little bit about issues related to scenario-based research that's taking place. Would you be able to talk a little bit about the benefits and limitations to that methodological approach as it compares to systematic social observation? Because we do have the opportunities for both types of research here. And what do you think is going to benefit one line of research versus the other, depending upon the methodological approach that's been taken?
Yeah, I think the scenario-based research idea really, I think, relates to scenario-based training. And the fact that, when we talk to line officers about their experiences with the cameras and with citizen interactions, that they tend to rely on prototypical situations and exemplars to illustrate differences, right? When the cameras might move the needle on the quality of the interaction and when they won't. So I think it would be helpful to, especially in terms of benefiting line officers in the conversation about research agendas, that we ground them in concrete scenarios and talk about, what would it take for a camera to have an effect on a particular dynamic in a particular situation? What is everything that's going on in there? For example, domestic violence based situations versus traffic situations, right? And just talk that through. So obviously it has research limitations because it's focused on a subsample of officer activity, but it is a way of bringing line officers into the research process to be very concrete about everyday jobs.
Great, thank you. Next, over to Joel. First, I really appreciated reading your piece. It was really solid work, relying on more data collected through BJA and or I guess that one's BJS and LEMAS data. But you talked a little bit about, or quite a bit about a 20 to 30% decline in fatal encounters. That's obviously about as big of an impact as we see in this field. To what extent do you think implementation matters in terms of fatal outcomes? Whether or not you're talking about the pilot programs that might be involving body-worn cameras, full deployment, as well as issues related to compliance to activation. How do you think these may affect outcomes?
Well, thanks for the question, Charles. Well, let me start by saying that, the 20 to 30% estimate is entirely sort of independent of our ability to measure levels or types of implementation in the data. So it's actually kind of interesting to note that in the 2016 survey that we used, and bearing in mind we had people who'd been implementing cameras in that for the sort of prior 3 years, even among that group, fully, I think only half of the treatment group had actually indicated in the survey that they had sort of fully deployed cameras, meaning that the rest were maybe sort of partially implemented, and fully a quarter actually indicated that they were still in a sort of pilot or a sort of experimental kind of phase. So, one could make the inference, we don't have like concrete data on this, but one could make the inference that if we'd actually been able to kind of measure that component alongside just the fact of having cameras. I mean, at a logical extreme, having a camera could mean they have a camera like in the cupboard and they're not using it, But if we've been able to sort of measure that, I think we might have, it's conceivable we might have actually found a stronger effect. I'll say one thing in terms of our data that maybe does speak to more concretely to the importance of implementation. And if you remember on the last sort of visual slide I put up, where I was able to look sort of year on year at how the effect of cameras had sort of changed. What you saw is a very sort of modest effect, if any, at sort of year zero, the year it was these cameras were acquired, and then a sort of successive increase in effect size. And what that suggests to me is that probably these police agencies were getting a greater handle on rolling out the cameras more widely, probably. and also probably learning how to use them and sort of building out their policies, probably concerning things like activation and use of footage and so on and so forth. And maybe also just the kind of cultural changes that produces in the organization. So you start to see these effects, at least in the period we were able to look at, that kind of magnify over time. So in short, yeah, I mean, I think we might, conceivably we might have found a bigger effect if we'd really taken account of the implementation level. But it certainly does seem, even from in a crude way from our data, that implementation does matter. And I know that others have looked at this in a more nuanced way, and have certainly found that the success of camera-based systems often depend on the quality of the policies and the sort of the accountability kind of culture that may already exist in an organization. I'm sure that would feed into that too.
Great, thank you. Moving over to John, would you be able to talk a little bit about issues involving unit of analysis? You guys have really been engaged in some unique work with regard to SSO, systematic social observation. There's been some, but there has not been near as much as perhaps what we expected. Going back 5 years ago, we really thought that it was going to be a little bit more advanced in this regard in terms of the number of people looking at these issues. But regardless, would you be able to talk a little bit about issues involving unit of analysis and what some of the opportunities are with body-worn cameras and how we might be able to look at this from different perspectives?
Sure. So I think one of the things that's true of what we just presented is that unit of analysis of the encounter is probably one of the weakest levels that you could look at for the body-worn camera footage, because it is kind of trying to get a snapshot of everything that just happened, right? So we have 20 minutes of video and we're trying to see if participation occurred or citizen disrespect occurred. It seems as though that, especially I think Willits and Macon and some of their colleagues have looked at the timing events, and that's a real advantage that you have with the body-worn camera footage, is that you can sort of really think about the way that encounters unfold and escalate or de-escalate. I think as we dive into the archives, I think some of the things that Professor Wood mentioned about training would be places where you could refer back to kinds of events, right? I think she's really right on there, that there are these kinds of events that probably have scripts that officers follow, and things that they're looking out for, that we could try to capture in something that's more of a micro theory approach than sort of the approach that systematic social observation has given us thus far. But with all the caveats that we have here, right, that this is an incomplete presentation, and I think we got to do a little more work to understand in what ways is it incomplete, in what ways is it accurate, right? And the other thing that we didn't do here is draw upon what exists from record management systems that could be merged with these data, right? That the police note who they encounter in their records management system, so we know that these data, at least to the extent police record it accurately, it's just that the camera doesn't tell us or doesn't allow us to make these judgments very well.
Absolutely. I do think you guys are on the cutting edge with some of that work. I really appreciate your comments. I know I've learned a lot from these presentations. With that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks everyone for your participation as well as your responses to Chuck's questions. At this point, I don't think we have any questions from the audience, so I'm going to send it over to John Markovic for any thoughts he may have.
Yeah, I'm gonna hopefully, can you all hear me? I'm gonna hopefully make this quick. I do have a quick question for Dr. Miller. So you use the difference in difference scores, and we look at your chart that the fatality rates were higher, it looked like, in the agencies that adopted BWCs. Is that
correct? Yeah.
Is that
absolutely.
correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, I guess that stands to reason, maybe because they were choosing them as a remedy to some problem, or probably tended to be larger departments.
I think size has a lot to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's sort of an interesting finding in and of itself. It would be interesting, I think, to do some other data analysis, probably using LEMIS, to see what factors drove adoption, whether it was internal factors, whether external factors such as, civil rights organizations, community pressure, aside from funding, maybe controlling from funding. But I think, who were the early adopters and why did they adopt, or were people adopting for different reasons? It probably has a lot to do with, I'm guessing, with the progressiveness of the department or some departments being forced into it. And now we see things changing where more states are mandating body-worn cameras. So, but I think in the earlier years, it's more of a pure adoption and it's at the agency's discretion. So I think that's maybe another area ripe for research. But I think overall, the presentations were great. I think I'm a big fan of RCTs, but I don't worship on the altar of RCTs. And I think this showed us some of the other kind of well-rounded, diverse research that could be done. So Dr. Miller's work focusing on, I think, a very important question for me, running the body-worn camera program. If we can say that they contribute to citizen safety and officer safety, I think that's another justification for the body-worn cameras. And I think you make that case with all the due cautions, based on the data. But I think using a large national data set as opposed to RCTs, I think rounds it off. And I think the other two presentations, Dr. Wood and Dr. McCluskey, I think to me, they're suggesting that there's a lot of value in looking at some of the more mundane encounters. Dr. White started off talking about complaints and use of force. Those are relatively rare events and sort of exceptional events. But these body-worn cameras are being used in a lot of routine encounters. Some of the work that we're doing with digital evidence management, 95% of these videos are kind of left on the cutting room floor. They don't get to the prosecutor, they don't get to the courts, but there's probably valuable information if we look at them, we look at the metadata and what can be learned about how the body-worn cameras are used, and I think in a lot of exceptional ways to improve citizen-police relations, and probably that those mundane encounters that don't get seen unless that the agency is sort of randomly reviewing officer videos, which is fairly common. But highlighting those agencies, like the agency putting its best footage forward, so to speak. So I think those are some other avenues. Showcasing the guardianship role as opposed to the warrior role, what types of incidents lend themselves to showcasing the guardianship role, what kind of situations, maybe what encounters, stop and talks, maybe some types of low-level field interviews where officers have great rapport. I think one of the other things, I'll stop after that, is we're looking at sort of exceptional uses, exemplar uses of body-worn cameras. Tom Woodmansee and I were looking into it. We're putting together a paper, and I think, and this ties to Dr. Wood's comments, I think early about the sort of younger people who are subjects of video cameras seem to be performance artists. I think probably there are some officers we're seeing that just sort of take naturally to the camera, and some of them use them in very purposeful ways to sort of provide a narrative and a documentary script almost about what they're doing. So they don't just turn on the cameras and behave normally. They're conscious of the cameras and they use them to say, okay, I'm walking up to this car now, and this is the reason I stopped this individual. I'm here by myself, but it looked like the passengers threw something out the window. So I'm going to control the situation. When my backup arrives, I'm going to go ask him or her to look, at the fence, across the fence where we think somebody threw something. I think we're just starting to evolve a sense of, the differential use of body-worn cameras. And it's, not just turning them on and expecting there to be an effect like some of the early RCTs done. It's, this is the binary. Did they have cameras or didn't they? And Chuck's question to Joel about, the context and the nuances, how they're used and the regime in which they're used. So I think we're kind of peeling away the layers of the onion here. So this is a great progression. I think a good exemplars of the type of research that can be done beyond the normal sort of what was routine use of force and complaint data. Some, look at evidentiary outcome, but just really leveraging the data in different ways and sort of the micro data that John McCluskey speaks to. So I think it's an exciting prelude to, I think, that the increasingly more nuanced type of research that'll be done. So great job to you all. Thanks, Chuck and Mike, for pulling this together. And I'll let you close it out, Mike.
All right, thank you, John. Our fearless leader, Chip Coldren, if you're still around, do you have any parting thoughts, or otherwise we can close it out?
Just a very quick thank you to everybody. It's really nice being involved in the day-to-day issues of implementing cameras to dig down into the research and learn this new stuff. So very, very fascinating. Appreciate it.
All right, well, thanks again to our presenters. And if questions arise, please send them to the TTA website or to me and specifically, and I'll make sure we get those answers. Thanks again, everyone, for participating. Take care.